Okay, so welcome back. This is week 2. Let's get this video lecture on the road. This week we are reading Ross Gay's Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude. This is one of my favorite poems, maybe all time. I hope you guys find something to like here too. So the reason I picked this poem is because I think on one level, it's pretty easy to get, right? If you understand the title, you sort of understand the poem. The catalog is a really long list. Unabashed means totally unashamed, just letting it all hang out there. Gratitude means thanks. So what do we have here? We have a long list of incredibly unashamed thankfulness. That's sort of what's going on here. At the same time, this poem uses a lot of technique. It shows a lot of emotion, and there's a lot of different ways to appreciate this poem, a lot of different angles and inroads, as it were. A note, I do know it's a really long poem. To that end, that's why it's the only thing we're reading all week. And in that way, it about balances out. It's about the same number of words that I had you read last week, just all in one big chunk. So take with it. Like Ross Gay tells you in the middle of this poem, it's okay to take a break and get a snack and come back to this one, but stick with it. Reading longer works builds your stamina, and that's a useful skill, right? That's valuable in and of itself. In terms of this piece, I really like the different ways that Ross Gay manages to express this gratitude and the way that he uses different poetic techniques to sort of get to that. Normally this would be the part where I would read to you from the poem, but in fact I found a great video of Ross Gay reading this poem, and rather than me reading it to you, I think why not go directly to the source. So if you haven't already, go ahead and pause this one and go listen to Ross Gay read this poem. It does take a minute. Feel free to read along with it while you're watching the video. Cancel two birds out with one stone. I think that's really useful. So having returned back to this and thinking through it, I think clearly that the idea here is that there is a lot of gratitude going on in this poem. And that sort of is a great way to start thinking about adding to our reading list. So adding to the number of techniques that we use when we're reading. Last week we talked about literal readings. So if we gave a literal reading of this poem, it starts off with him having a dream in which a force in his dream tells him that he has to bellow forth gratitude. And then he does so. And he talks about a lot of different things specifically that he has gratitude for. He paints a lot of different specific scenes. I don't think it would do me a lot of benefit or do you a lot of benefit to hear me go through all of them individually. But you can see him talking about the orchard that he built. You can see him talking about various things that have happened in his past. You can see him breaking through and talking to the audience that's reading his poem. One of the most interesting aspects of this poem for me is the way that Ross Gay combines so many different subjects and ideas in really close space. So there's actually a term for that, and it's one of the terms I want you guys to know for your test. The first one for this week, the word is juxtaposition, and I'll spell that for you, Juxtaposition. So yeah, juxtaposition literally means the act of placing two things near each other to create an effect. Juxtaposition, the act of placing two things near each other to create an effect. So for instance, images take on meanings when they're put together. Let me give you a really simple example. If I show you an apple, that doesn't mean necessarily any specific thing. But if I show you an apple with a snake curled around it, suddenly apples plus serpents, we're probably thinking a little bit towards the story of Adam and Eve, right? And just by putting those two objects together, we create a meaning that wasn't there originally in either of those first two works. I think that's kind of awesome and intriguing. Ross Gay uses a ton of juxtaposition throughout this piece. And in fact, your writing assignment and one of your term definitions is to find the different ways that he uses it, the different images that he combines right next to each other, and the potential meaning that it's suggested. A lot of times with juxtaposition, it's not as straightforward as two obvious images come together to create a story. But for instance, and I'll give you one just to sort of open it up here, immediately after he finishes talking about this orchard, and this is on it's the second page of the poem as it's printed out. I know that you're probably not looking at it paginatedly, so that's not as helpful. But he's talking about this orchard, and he talks about how it's really this beautiful thing that came out of not so beautiful things. And immediately after that, he says, "Thank you for not taking my pal," when the engines of his mind dragged him to Swiss fistful of Xanax and a bottle or two of booze. "And thank you for taking my father. A few years after his own father went down. Thank you, mercy, mercy, thank you." So he went from talking about a beautiful orchard to talking about how a friend almost died but didn't, and he's thankful for that, to talking about how his father did die, and he's thankful for that. That's a wild juxtaposition, right? In the orchard we have life, right? The beginnings of things, literally growing something out of nothing is what it talks about. And then we combine that with destruction as a bad idea, i.e. someone nearly committing suicide and not. And then we follow it up with destruction as an oddly positive force, right? It says mercy, mercy, which gives me the thought process that his father might have been in pain or something similar to that. And as a result, there's sort of, it says a lot more about creation and death by having all three of those things next to each other. Thank you for creation. Thank you for the avoidance of death when it should be avoided. And strangely, thank you for the non-avoidance of death when it is necessary. Thank you for the cycle, it seems to suggest, by having all three of those things right next to each other. Maybe. So that's juxtaposition, and I think it's really interesting and important, and it's something to help you understand poems that might be otherwise confusing, right? If you see in a poem two images next to each other that just don't seem to make sense, it could be that the reason that's being done is to create one of these juxtapositional effects. So what does it mean to have image X next to image Y, idea X next to idea Y? And I would add that juxtaposition can often be thought of visually, i.e. two objects literally next to each other in space, but when we talk about it in poetry, we're often talking more about ideas. So putting two concepts next to each other, two images or stories. I've been using this word imagery a lot, and I will continue to. Let's define it. So this is another, again, term that you could find on your test. The term is imagery, I-M-A-G-E-R-Y. And imagery is language that creates a sensory experience in the reader's mind. And again, just to say it again, imagery is language that creates a sensory experience in the reader's mind. The idea here is that not all of poetry, but a great deal of it can cause the audience, the reader, to sense something. So if a poem describes something visual, oftentimes you can't help but picture it in your head. And that is known as an image. So I talked about the image of a friend almost committing suicide, but not. The image of this of this orchard, right? These are things that you can imagine physically most of the time. So mainly when we think of imagery, we think of visually, but I want to point out that images in poetry and images in writing generally are anything you can sense. So that includes smells, touches, hearing, it's sounds, obviously. Any of the above can also make sensory imagery. So that is an important way to talk about what a poem is doing, right? It helps you break it down into separate units in sort of ways, right? It sort of helps you to think about it in distinct parts. The poet is making me picture this, then the poet makes me picture this. And adding those two together, adding images together, sort of where juxtaposition comes from. So that's our second. A couple more things I want to point out, terms that are coming into use here that I think are really important and that help us understand this. Next up, jargon, and I'm just going to spell that. That's a short one, J-A-R-G-O-N. Jargon is language associated with a particular field, profession, or interest. So again, language associated with a particular field, profession, or interest. So you can talk about computer jargon, you can talk about writer jargon, you can talk about skateboarding jargon, and specifically in this poem, we hear a ton of gardening jargon. Ross Gay's worked as a gardener, is clearly very invested in gardening, and you can see that. Not only in the long passage that deals with the word volunteer, which has a certain specific meaning for gardeners beyond the traditional meaning that we probably all understand, but also in the long list of plants' names. So why is that important? Why do we need to think about that? What does that help us understand with poems? Well, jargon helps to create tone and sometimes voice. It helps to establish what we're doing here, and it gives you a context for what's going on. Also, it just kind of is a chance for the writer to delight in the weirdness of language. I think it's sort of awesome that so many different interests and fields and professions have their own language, these words that only they know. I was watching this documentary about sneakerheads, people who are way too into sneakers, and they have their own words for it. Like the word colorway is apparently refers to the color pattern specifically used on a shoe. And I just think it's cool that there's a word for that. And a lot of times you'll find poets finding and ferreting out these words to use in their own work, to sort of add an interest to the language and also to establish the tone. I want to point out, everyone knows jargon, right? Everyone knows a field well enough to know words that are specific to it. Sometimes I have students say, well, I don't know jargon. I just, you learn jargon at jobs. There's restaurant jargon. You learn jargon in special interest fields. There's computer game jargon. There's jargon to Twitter. There's jargon to all sorts of different, whatever it is that you're interested in, there's probably a specific vocabulary to that interest or field. And that's something you have access to, which you will need later on, which is important. Final term, and then we'll wrap this particular video up, anaphora. Anaphora is the repetition of a beginning phrase. So you'll see this in poems a lot. We've already seen it in a couple, and definitely Ross Gay is up to it. Repeating a starting phrase. So in this poem, so many of the lines start with thank you. He says it over and over again. Thank you this, thank you that, thank you this, thank you this. The effect of anaphora is that it creates sort of this call and response. It lets the audience understand what to expect, and it also allows the writer to sort of move around on a theme, right? Once you establish this given pattern, you can start doing things to it. So for instance, and again, I've already talked about it, but this is another way to highlight juxtaposition, right? Thank you for this, thank you for this, thank you for that. And these are all very different things. But setting up that pattern sort of asked me to think about how thanks, the original idea, relates back to this. Anaphora is, again, very important and famous. You can see it all over the place. Martin Luther King's most famous speech, I have a dream, centers around an anaphoric response. I have a dream that I'll do this. I have a dream that this will happen. I have a dream that this will happen. The repetition both sows that idea even deeper in your consciousness and also lets you start reflecting about what it's supposed to mean. So, those are our ideas and concepts for this week. Questions? Let me know. You'll get a chance to explore these ideas further on soon enough. And other than that, I look forward to seeing what you guys think about this poem, what your thoughts are on it, and anything else you guys might have to share with me. So thank you very much. Again, let me know if there's anything I can do to help you out.